Welcome to Africa Insight. In this week's video, I'm joined by my colleague Louw, and today we'll be talking about the Zambian elections which just happened on August the 13th. So Louw, maybe give us a breakdown about the elections and who won and what happened.
Well, we've discussed this in Africa Insight before, and you'll recall the last time we spoke about this, our expectations were that the incumbent President Hakainde Hichilema was likely going to earn re-election, and that the ruling party, his party, the UPND, was likely going to achieve the majority that it failed to achieve in 2021, when he obviously famously defeated Edgar Lungu. Looking at the final results that were released yesterday, but the picture was pretty clear by Monday already that he had an unassailable lead over his nearest challenger, Brian Mundubile. Looking at the results, you'll see that he earned in the presidential elections about 60.5% of the support, which last time was 59, so a slight uptick over what we saw in 2021. Brian Mundubile did fairly well on debut. He was largely unknown at the beginning of the year, and then obviously stepped into the breach left by the PF, who couldn't get its house in order and eventually didn't nominate a presidential candidate at all. Brian Mundubile, a longtime PF lawmaker and someone who served previously in the Lungu administration, stepped into that breach, the leader of the Tonse Alliance, and with Makebe Zulu, ran on a platform in a party that no one had really heard of before either, the NRPUP, won about 38% of the vote, which again is kind of consistent with what Lungu got last time around, slightly less, but it's quite clear that the people who voted for Lungu in 21 pretty much voted for Mundubile. And as someone who yesterday had the misfortune of having to draw the electoral map for our talking point, you would have seen again the support in the country was very much split. In the west, the south and the northwest provinces, that side of the country, Hichilema won by a landslide. But then in the north and in the eastern province, Mchinga, the NRPUP and Mundubile did rather well.
Also in the Copper Belt, which is also a very important area, we saw some good isolation in there.
Yeah, so the Copper Belt was an interesting one because it was slightly divided. It's not so clear on the electoral map because a lot of the constituencies won by Mundubile were quite small. But if you do zoom in on the Copper Belt, you'll see that he did rather well. Picked up lots of constituencies, and so those middle provinces, the Copper Belt, Lusaka, and the central provinces were a little divided. But end of the day, the winning margin was more than 1 million votes. So it's a fairly handsome victory. And then on the parliamentary side of things, as we mentioned previously, this was the first time that Zambia was running an election on their new electoral system. And so the new electoral system was really almost designed to help the UPND get over the line and get that majority that it missed out on in 2021. So besides the fact that they had won more constituencies than the NRPUP, nationwide, there were also those 40 proportional representation seats available. The 40 are for female, youth and people with disability representation, and the winner of the election effectively gets the lion's share of those. So 24 of the 40 went to the UPND. The president can also name 11 special members, and the presiding officers, that's another 14 seats in the House. So that's a nice whack to go on top of the seats that the UPND had won, and so they have a fairly healthy majority in the House. The NRPUP ended up with, I think, 71 seats in a 280-member National Assembly. So,
they'll still be able to make some noises in opposition, but it seems that Hichilema will at least have slightly easier run at policy with majority, as you mentioned.
Absolutely.
But Louw, let's just talk about some interesting stuff. Zambia's, considered, I know it falls within Southern Africa, but it's also kind of East Africa. But probably, when we look at that region, I consider it, at least from my political risk perspective, a very peaceful country. And generally with elections we see there. But we saw there was some funny business around. We wouldn't say this is a completely facade or flawed election, but there were problems. Could you maybe unpack some of those problems?
Yeah, so there were problems. And I think that even last week when I was speaking to the media about our election expectations, there were questions being posed in terms of when we were discussing these constitutional amendments, these changes, whether or not Zambia was going in the same direction as Zimbabwe, which is really as a misnomer. Zambia's got a fairly proud democratic tradition. The country's gone through multiple changes of government, peaceful changes of government. Like you said, violence is not really part of the electoral landscape, although it does happen, and this time round it was no different. There were instances. But there were problems. and they became quite clear over the weekend. It was a very stressful weekend for me watching the polls. First thing we saw on Friday was that the counting and the announcement of results were suspended. The Electoral Commission of Zambia said this was done because there was violence at certain polling stations and ballot boxes had been snatched by individuals. At the same time, Mundubile claimed victory, saying he'd won both the presidential and the parliamentary elections. All of this happened on Friday. And so the election had gone from a calm voting day with no major incidents to, frankly, a little bit of chaos on Friday. Voting resumed later on Friday, so that disruption didn't last that long. But as you know, a disruption to counting, even a small disruption, is all that's required in order for suspicion to build and for people to draw conclusions about what had happened. And over the weekend, there was lots of social media speculation about Mundubile had been arrested, Mundubile had even been killed. Some people were speculating online. We found out then on Sunday evening when the Secretary to Cabinet announced that there had been a military operation on the night of the voting, that Thursday night, which later turned out was at Mundubile's house. 11 people had been arrested, including people that were accused of being part of a militia, working with foreign actors, said that they found military-grade weapons in their possession. And seemingly there was plan to subvert the election afoot. Now, Mundubile has consistently claimed that that wasn't the case at all, that members of his Tonse alliance were just picked up by the army, that he himself and his wife were taken to army headquarters in the middle of the night. He doesn't seem like he was kept in custody, but some of his party members most certainly were. And he just said that shots were fired at his house, including someone who was hit. And he said it wasn't the police who visited his home, it was the army. So, needless to say, that also just adds to this tarnishing of Zambia's reputation as an outlier, as a democratic bellwether in the region. And so the election has kind of produced the outcome that we had expected, almost exactly what we had expected, but not the election that we wanted, election period that we wanted. And so we have a Hichilema administration that is perhaps starting its new term with a bit of a legitimacy deficit, specifically amongst those people, those millions of people who voted for Mundubile and those who feel that their votes were not counted.
Well, that's just interesting. I've got obviously two big countries coming up in my region next year. Got Nigeria in January and Kenya in August. So, just looking at what you sort of looked at this election, do you think that some of these trends are trends that are, and you've also had other elections in other your countries, do you think these are some continuous trends across the continent where we're seeing varying styles of elections, where there are ones where are just completely stolen, then there are ones that are free, and then we could say Zambia is kind of in a greyish area?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think when we've often spoken to clients and we've gone that it feels that in Southern Africa, which is the region that I'm responsible for, that countries tend to fall into two broad categories. You have countries like Zimbabwe, Mozambique and Angola, where the incumbents have been in power since the end of colonization, since independence, and they really don't leave anything up to chance. And so those elections are by no means free or fair, and the opposition are really up against it. And it's very difficult to imagine there's going to be a change in power. And there are other countries where we've seen multiple changes, peaceful transfers of power, Zambia being one of those. We saw it most recently in Malawi, an imperfect election, but an election where...
Botswana as well.
Botswana was the big surprise. Botswana was a country where the BDP had been in charge for 60 years, and suddenly the opposition sprung a surprise and they won that election. But then you have these countries that, and I'm thinking now specifically about a country like Namibia, which had their election recently as well, where SWAPO has been in charge since independence, a fairly robust opposition, and the elections are free and fair, but imperfect. And so sometimes it feels a little bit like these imperfect elections, they're not stolen elections as such, but they most certainly benefit the incumbent. And I think in Zambia this time as well, a lot of things that happened beforehand, they benefited the incumbent and they made life very difficult for the opposition. And the opposition, all things equal, looking at the results now, did very well, considering they came into this election really off balance. So you have those countries that sit on that sort of grey zone, and sometimes wonder about where does South Africa fall into that.
Yeah, exactly.
Because South Africa is a country where we have had free and fair elections, and we've seen increasingly over the last 3 election cycles the ANC's support drop precipitously, to the point where they were effectively out of government after 2024 and were forced to go into a coalition with their long-time rivals. The question with countries like that often is it going to continue like that until the liberation movement in fact finds itself out of power, or we're going to start seeing some kind of funny business? Not really the case in South Africa yet, but we've also seen counter movements emerge out of that dynamic, and then things become quite unpredictable. Umkhonto weSizwe party being that. Now, in terms of what does that mean for a place like Kenya and Nigeria, both countries have had some troubled elections in the past. I don't know where exactly do they fall on the spectrum.
If I just think about what you're saying now, if I just think about it in my coverage right now, Kenya seems like, and Nigeria is where the incumbents will have the structures in place to favor them winning in like a similar position where I don't think they'll fudge the results, but they are structural advantages they have. So that's the way I think it's going to head. So I think Ruto and Tinubu will stay in power, but there'll be some messy business. That's my sort of thoughts on it. So I think it is quite concerning, Louw, but your coverage of Zambia has been excellent. It's given us an idea of where democracy is heading, at least. And it's an important country, Zambia, especially for copper and the 4th Industrial Revolution. And let's hope that Hichilema can do well. They've also got things pending on the IMF. And,
the thing with Zambia is that I think markets have been relatively positive in their response to his victory, largely because it was anticipated. And we know from experience that markets, what they hate more than anything else is unpredictability and surprises.
He's quite a market-friendly guy from what I checked.
Also a market-friendly guy. We've seen him introduce some significant reforms since coming into power, and we can now really only imagine that he's going to kick on with those reforms, perhaps even take it further now that he has that majority in parliament. We've another media interview I had this week where we mentioned that investors sometimes have got a very high tolerance for funny business around the elections. They've got a lower tolerance for surprises. They have a higher tolerance, and they're willing to work with regimes, even regimes that, like this one, perhaps comes in with a bit of a legitimacy deficit. But as long as they know who's in charge, they know who's going to be in charge, not just today, but in 5 years' time, and they know they can work with that person.
Exactly. I think that's very interesting. I think let's leave it at that. Thanks, Louw.
Okay.
Thank you for joining Africa Insight this week. If you'd like more information on our products or services, please visit our website or socials.